want to begin today with a question, a very simple question. Why do I feel guilty for doing what's best for me? Hello, and welcome back to From the Therapy Room Psychology of Mind and Body, understanding how we feel, think, pattern, and become. I'm your host, Jyoti, a clinical counseling psychotherapist. I'm really glad you're here. You're welcome to follow this space and stay connected. This is a space where we gently explore the inner landscapes of human mind, where psychology meets lived experience, and where the stories we carry inside finally find language. In this podcast, we explore the psychology behind everyday emotional experiences, the things we often struggle to understand within ourselves. The question I asked earlier, it's a very simple question, but one that quietly carries an enormous amount of emotional weight for so many people. Have you ever said no to something and then spent the next several hours replaying it in your mind, wondering if you were too harsh, too selfish, too insensitive, too much? Have you ever decided not to answer something immediately and then felt this strange internal discomfort, almost like anxiety, almost like guilt, as if your silence was somehow hurting someone? Have you ever taken a day off to rest only to discover that your body was lying still, but your mind absolutely refused to rest? Because something inside kept whispering, you should be doing something, you're being lazy. Other people manage more. Why are you like this? Or maybe you choose distance from someone who kept draining you, and instead of relief, you felt guilt, a heavy guilt, maybe even grief, even though logically you know distance was necessary. Any of this feels familiar, I want to tell you something very important. This episode is for you because what we are talking about today is not simply guilt, and it's definitely not weakness. It is something psychologically much deeper. Today we are exploring this question: why do I feel guilty for doing what is actually good for me? Why does rest feel selfish? Why does saying no feel cruel? And why does protecting your peace sometimes make you feel like the villain in your own story? Why does choosing yourself feel emotionally dangerous? And if this is your struggle, please know you are far from alone. Because in therapy rooms, this shows up constantly, different ages, different professions, different relationship histories, different personalities, but underneath the details, the emotional pattern often sounds strikingly similar. Someone says something like this: I know I need boundaries. I know I can't keep saying yes. I know this relationship exhausts me. I know I need rest. So why do I feel so terrible for choosing myself? And that question is exactly where today's conversation begins. Because often what people call guilt is not actually guilt in the way they think. Sometimes what they are feeling is conditioning, sometimes attachment fear, sometimes trauma activation, sometimes emotional memory, and sometimes a nervous system reacting to an old rule that no longer serves them. And we don't understand that, we start believing something is wrong with us. And but maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe your mind and body are doing exactly what they were trained to do. And healing begins when we understand that. I remember a client once saying something that stayed with me. She said, I finally said no to helping someone with something I genuinely didn't have capacity for. And then I couldn't sleep that night. And I asked her, what were you telling yourself? And she said that I was a bad person. That sentence, so many people live inside that sentence because for some people, saying no doesn't mean saying no. It means maybe I'm selfish. Maybe I'm disappointing someone. Maybe I'll think differently, or they'll think differently of me. Maybe I have damaged the relationship. Maybe I'm not a good daughter. Maybe I'm not a good friend, good partner, and good human being. And what's fascinating psychologically is that the actual event may be incredibly small, a delayed reply, declining an invitation, needing some space, or resting, or turning your phone off, not emotionally overextending, yet internally. It can feel enormous. Why? Because the emotional meaning attached to the act is much bigger than the act itself. And this is where we need to make a very important distinctions. Feeling guilty does not automatically mean you have done something wrong. Let me say that again. Feeling guilty does not automatically mean you have done something wrong. Because emotions are not always objective truths. Sometimes emotions are historical echoes, an old emotional alarm system, a conditioned response, an internalized rule, and many of us carry invisible rules we never consciously choose. Rules like good people others first, kind people don't disappoint others, strong people don't need much, and loving people sacrifice. Good daughters don't upset families, or good partners stay available. Helpful people say yes. And if those were the emotional rules shaping your inner world, then choosing yourself can feel like violating something sacred, even when choosing yourself is healthy. And this is why people get confused. Logically, they know one thing, emotionally, they feel another. And when logic and emotional conditioning collide, internal conflicts begin. Now, let's talk about something people often misunderstand deeply, people pleasing. I know I have talked about in my other episode too, because people often describe themselves by saying, "Oh, I'm just a people pleaser," as if it's simply a personality trait, as if it means being nice, caring, accommodating, generous. And yes, sometimes kindness is a genuine kindness, but clinically, people pleasing often has a much deeper psychological story. People pleasing is not kindness, it is survival. That distinction matter enormously because survival behavior are not chosen from freedom, they are chosen from fear. And often the fear is not even fully conscious. For example, a child growing up in an emotionally unpredictable environment may learn something powerful very early. If mother is upset, the atmosphere changes. If father withdraws, connections disappears. If conflicts happens, things become tense. If expressing needs create criticism, having needs starts to feel dangerous. So the child adapts without language, without conscious strategy. The nervous system simply learns keep people happy. Stay easy, don't create problem, read the room, stay useful, stay agreeable, and stay emotionally available. And over time, this becomes identity, not just behavior. And this is where the conversation becomes even more psychological revealing. When I say that people pleasing can be a survival adaptation, I would like to slow down here a bit. Because many people hear that and think, but my childhood wasn't traumatic. And this is important. Not all emotional conditionings comes from dramatic trauma. Not all wounds come from obvious abuse. Sometimes the shaping happens in subtler ways, repeating emotional experiences, unspoken family rules, conditional approvals, parentification, criticism, emotional dismissal, high expectations, or simply growing up in an environment where your emotional needs did not much have much space. And so the child learns something quietly, not through explanation, but through his own experiences. Something like, my feelings make things complicated. My needs burden people. It's easier if I adjust. Peace matters more than authenticity. Connection requires self control. Love may need performance. I remember a client once telling me something striking. He said, I can instantly tell when someone's energy changes, even if say they're nothing. I know if they are annoyed, disappointed, emotionally distant, irritated. I just know. And on the surface, people often interpret this as emotional intelligence, like sensitivity, empathy, depth. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's hypervigilance. And those are not the same things. Emotional intelligence says I notice emotional cues while staying grounded. Hypervigilance says I must constantly monitor emotional cues to stay safe. That changes everything because one emerges from regulation and another from survival. And many highly emotionally attuned adults were once children who had to become excellent emotional readers. Not because they were gifted, because unpredictability required adaptation. So as adult, they become incredibly tuned into everyone else. Who is upset, who is withdrawing, or who sounded slightly different in that text message, who used a period instead of an emoji, who replied late, and begin working overtime. What happened? Did I do something? Are they upset? Should I fix it? So should I message? Should I apologize? And notice what's happening here. The emotional system become externally organized, meaning inner peace depends on external emotional stability. That is exhausting because other people's mood become internal weather. And if you grow up unconsciously managing emotional climates, boundaries can feel terrifying because boundaries interrupt your old role. And old roles, even painful ones, can feel psychologically safe than change. I once had a client say something so beautifully honest. She laughed while saying it, but there was pain underneath. She said, I feel responsible for everyone's emotional comfort, even strangers. And I asked, what happens if someone is disappointed? She immediately said, I feel physically uncomfortable. That's important because many people think this is purely mental. It isn't. This lives in the body deep. And if you have ever wondered why does guilt feel so physical, this is where neuroscience helps us. Because when someone with relational anxiety or people pleasing conditioning sets a boundary, the body may react as though something dangerous has happened, even though logically nothing dangerous has happened. Your heart races, your stomach tightens, your chest feels heavy, your thoughts accelerate, you feel the urge to explain yourself, you over explain, you justify, you reverse your decision, you repair immediately. Why? Because your nervous system may not interpret boundary setting as health, it may interpret it as relational threat. And this makes profound sense when we understand attachment. Human beings are wired for connection. Historically, disconnection could mean danger. So, when emotional conditioning links boundary setting with possible rejection, your body doesn't calmly say, wonderful, healthy adult decision. It may say, warning, connection, instability detected. And then survival physiology activates. This is why some people say, I know setting boundaries is healthy, but I feel panic afterward. That panic isn't irrational, it's meaningful. It's often your history is speaking through your nervous system, not your present reality. Healing involves learning to tell the difference. Let me give you another therapy room example. A client once told me, I turned my phone off for 3 hours because I needed quiet. And then she said, but the whole time I couldn't relax because I kept imagining someone needing me and thinking I was rude. Think about that. The body was physically resting, the mind was still serving. This is what chronic self abandonment often look like. Being physically present with yourself while psychologically remaining emotionally available to everyone else. And over time, that creates exhaustion. resentment, confusion, emotional depletion. Because if your worth has become unconsciously linked with usefulness, rest can feel threatening. If your identity is built around being needed, space can feel destabilizing. And if your belonging is linked with accommodation, authenticity can feel risky. And this is why healing people pleasing isn't simply about just saying no. That's advice is far too simplistic. Because for some people, saying no isn't merely behavior, it touches attachment, identity, worth, self, belonging, all those things, and that deserve compassion, not judgment. Because this is where many people have one of those deeply uncomfortable but deeply liberating realization. The guilt they feel today may not be entirely to today. It may be older than they think. And when I say childhood conditioning, I meant this is in simplistic sense of blaming parent. That's not what this is. Human beings are shaped by system, family, culture, emotional climate, attachment experiences, what was modeled, what was rewarded, what was punished, what was ignored, what included, what left, what was unsafe. I mean, there are so many things, and children are extremely adaptive. That's one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking things about human psychology. Children will adapt to almost any emotional environment to preserve connection even when the adaptation costs them authenticity, because connection matters that much. A child cannot think in adult psychological language. A child doesn't say, "Ah, I see I'm developing a fond response due to relational unpredictability." Of course not. A child simply feels, learns, adapts, internalizes, and those adaptations often become adulthood patterns. Let me give you example of emotional rules many people unknowingly inherited, maybe directly, maybe silently. Rules like don't upset people, don't talk back, be grateful, be respectful, don't be selfish, think of others first, don't be dramatic, stop crying, good children don't argue, be the bigger person, don't embarrass the family. These messages may sound ordinary, some even culturally normalized. And to be fair, not every message is inherently harmful. Context, intensity, frequency, and emotional meaning matters. But when these messages become rigid emotional laws, something begins to happen. The child starts translating them psychologically, not just behaviorally. So don't upset people, become other people's emotional comfort is my responsibility. Don't be selfish becomes having need is morally wrong. Keep the peace becomes conflict is dangerous. And be respectful becomes self protection, may be disrespectful. And don't be dramatic becomes my emotional reality is excessive. I mean, there must be all the things. Be grateful becomes pain should be silenced if others have done things for me. And suddenly adulthood starts making sense, because now saying no doesn't mean saying no, it means violating an emotional law. That's why guilt arrives so fast. I remember a client once saying something that was deeply revealing. She said, "I wanted one weekend alone, just one weekend." And then she paused and said, "But I felt like I was becoming a terrible daughter." That's the emotional story. Not I need rest, but if I choose rest, I become someone bad. That is identity level interpretation. An identity linked guilt feels powerful because human can tolerate discomfort more easily than identity threat. Because for many people, this is not merely about behavior, it's about who they fear becoming: selfish, cold, unloving, disloyal, difficult, unkind, ungrateful, harsh. And if your emotional history taught you those labels were dangerous, your system will find hard against anything resembling them, even healthy boundaries. We say that if usefulness becomes identity, rest can feel like worthlessness. which explains why some people physically stop but psychologically cannot stop because stillness activates identity anxiety. Who am I if I'm not doing? That's not laziness, that's conditioning. I'd like to talk about attachment because this deepens everything. Attachment psychology tells us something profoundly human. Every early relational experiences shape expectations about love, safety, closeness, and self worth, not permanently but powerfully. If love felt stable, responsive, emotionally safe, people often develop greater internal security. But if love felt inconsistent, conditional, emotionally unpredictable, or critical or intertwined with performance, very different belief system may form. And those beliefs often sound like love can disappear. I need to stay careful. I must not upset people. Connection is fragile. I must earn closeness. Disappointment is dangerous. And if those beliefs are active, choosing yourself doesn't feel uncomfortable, it feels like emotional risk. Because somewhere inside an older part is still asked, what if choosing me cost me love? And that question can silently organize an entire life. Because once we understand attachment, so many confusing emotional reactions suddenly begin to make sense. And I want to say this clearly. Attachment is it's not about blaming your childhood. It's about understanding your emotional blueprint, understanding why certain relational experiences feel disproportionately intense, why a delayed text can feel emotionally loaded, why saying no can trigger anxiety that seems much bigger than the moment itself. Why did your nervous system learns about your closeness? Closeness feel safe, predictable, emotionally responsive, or did closeness feel uncertain, conditional, unstable, something to be worked for, something that could disappear because human beings don't just think about relationships, we embody them. We carry emotional templates, and those templates quietly shape how we interpret present moment. Not one pattern, especially relevant here, is anxious attachment. And if you resonate with this, please listen gently. This is not pathology, this is human adaptation. People with anxious attachment often deeply value closeness. Connection matters enormously, but connection may also feel fragile, uncertain, easy to lose. So the emotional system becomes highly alert to sign of relational disruption, a slow reply, a different tone, distance, disappointment, a reduced enthusiasm, silence. And because the nervous system interprets these signals through old emotional lens, the meaning can become amplified. Not they must be busy, but something is wrong. Not they are disappointed, but I have damaged the relationship. Not they need a space, but they are pulling away. This is where guilt often becomes intertwined with attachment fear. Because if somewhere inside you believe disappointing people create distance and distance threaten connection, then saying no becomes emotionally loaded. And it's no longer just a boundary, it's become a perceived relationship risk. You can intellectually understand boundaries and still panic when setting one. Because cognition and nervous system conditionings are not the same thing. That distinctions matters deeply in healing. Let's talk about another pattern relationship hyper responsibility. This is extremely common in people who feel guilty for choosing themselves. It sounds like I'm responsible for how other feels. I should have handled that differently, or I should have softened it, or I should have explained more, or I should have anticipated their reaction, or I should prevent discomfort. This create chronic emotional labor because suddenly relationships become jobs, internal jobs, monitoring, adjusting, managing, repairing, predicting, appeasing, and eventually it leads to exhaustion. resentment, invisible burnout, because no human being can sustainably manage everyone else's internal world. That's psychologically impossible. Yet many people try because emotionally it feels necessary. I once said, if someone is disappointed because of me, I feel like I have failed. That's such a profound statement because disappointment become moralized. Not they feel disappointed, but I failed. That emotional fusion is incredibly important here. And this often comes from environments where emotional harmony was linked with worth. If everyone is okay, I'm okay. If someone is upset, I did something wrong. That's not healthy empathy. That's emotional fusion. And emotional fusions makes individuation difficult. Now, individuation matters here because individuation in the psychology process of becoming a separate self, a differentiated human being, someone who can remain connected without losing themselves, someone who can tolerate disagreement without collapse, someone who can say, you may not like this decision, and I can still remain internally stable. I mean, that's profound emotional maturity. But if emotional development happened in environments where separation felt unsafe, individuation become difficult. Being separate, many unconsciously feel being rejected. And this is why some adults confuse autonomy with abandonment. Choosing spaces feel like abandonment. Setting limits feels like cruelty. Authenticity feels risky. That confusion create enormous suffering, especially in intimate relationship, because then people become trapped in impossible emotional equation. If I choose myself, I hurt others. If I protect myself, I lose connection. If I tell the truth, I create distance. If I rest, I fail people. If I need a space, I become selfish. And when these internal equations operate silently, people become experts in self betrayal. I mean, that phrase is painful but important. Self betrayal doesn't usually look dramatic, it looks very ordinary. Saying yes when you mean no, explaining when silence was enough, replying when exhausted, and overfunctioning while emotionally undernourished. This is how many people abandon themselves quietly, not because they are weak, because adaptation once made sense. I would like to talk about something especially important, disorganized attachment. Because some people don't simply fear rejection, they also fear closeness. This create painful contradiction. I need connection. Connection overwhelms me. I want love. Love feels dangerous. I want boundaries. Boundaries make me panic. This push pull pattern can create profound guilt because the person doesn't even fully understand their own conflicting needs, and confusion becomes shame. What's wrong with me? Usually nothing is wrong. Conflicting protective systems are operating simultaneously. That deserves compassion, not self-attack. Talk about something incredibly important here. Sometimes the guilt you carry is not just personal, it's cultural, relational, gendered, intergenerational, socially reinforced, inherited not from family but from emotional system. And this matters because many people sit in therapy believing, why am I like this, when a more accurate question may be, what message shaped me into this? That changes the conversation from self blame to understanding. Many cultures deeply value community, interdependence, respect, sacrifice, family, responsibility, and emotional duty. And to be clear, these values are not inherently harmful. Human beings need community, belonging matters, care matters. I mean, all those things are important. The problem begins when healthy care becomes compulsory self eraser, when sacrifice becomes identity, when guilt becomes the emotional glue that maintain belonging. That's where suffering begins. Example, many people grow up absorbing messages like family comes first, elders must never be disappointed, or good children sacrifice, or respect means compliance, or personal needs are indulgent. Imagine growing up with these messages and then becoming an adult who needs boundary. Of course, there will be an internal conflict because psychologically, you're not just setting a boundary, you may feel like you are violating a moral code. That creates deep guilt, not because boundaries are wrong, because old emotional framework interpret them as disloyal. About how it is coming from gender ways because this shows up profoundly, particularly in women, caregivers, nurturers, emotionally responsible personalities. Because many women grow up receiving subtle and overt messages about emotional labor: be accommodating, be soft, be understanding, be available, be patient, forgiving, emotionally intelligent, think about others, don't be difficult, don't be demanding, don't be cold, don't be too much. And if these messages becomes deeply internalized, what happens? Adult women often become extraordinary caretakers, emotionally aware, responsive, giving, relationally attentive, but many also becomes profoundly disconnected from permission. Permission to rest, permission to say no, permission to disappoint, permission to choose self-preservation. That creates chronic guilt because now self protection feels like identity violation. A client once said something with tears in her eyes: I know how to care for everyone. I genuinely don't know how to care for myself without feeling selfish. That sentence captures so much because competence in caregiving does not automatically mean emotional freedom. Sometimes it means conditioning. And this isn't only women, men experience different but equally painful conditioning. Message like be strong, don't be too much, handle it, don't be emotional, don't be burdened, be reliable, be productive. So for many men, doing what's best for themselves may trigger a different kind of guilt. Not I'm selfish, but I'm weak, I'm failing, I should handle more, I shouldn't rest, I should push through. Same suffering, different language. Comes from highly responsible personalities because some people become the dependable one, the stable one, the one everyone relies on, the one who remembers everything, manages everything, hold anything, but internally the person may be drowning because external competence can hide internal depletion. And when someone's identity become be helper, be strong, be reliable, the mature one, choosing themselves can feel psychologically destabilizing because if I stop being who everyone relies on, who am I? Will I still matter? Will I still be valued? Will I still be loved? I mean, that's not superficial, that's existential. What I have observed is also coming from spirituality and morality from a moment because this gets complicated too. Some people I internalize distorted version of compassion, distorted version of love, distorted versions of goodness. Ideas like love means endless sacrifice, forgiveness means no boundaries, compassion means tolerating harm, and patience means self neglect. I mean, goodness means emotional availability all the time. That's not mature compassion, that's self eraser disguised as virtue. Healthy compassion includes self respect. Healthy love includes boundaries. Healthy generosity includes choice. Healthy care includes reciprocity. Without that, care becomes depletion. And depletion eventually becomes resentment. Important. Not all guilt is healthy. This distinction matters enormously because some listeners may think so guilt is always conditioning. No. Healthy guilt exists. Healthy guilt says, I harmed someone, I acted out of alignment with my values, I crossed my boundaries, I caused unnecessary pain. That guilt can be morally useful. It helps repair, reflect, recalibrate. But condition guilt sound different. Condition guilt says someone is uncomfortable, someone expects more, someone is disappointed, someone wanted access, someone doesn't like my boundaries. This is not the same thing, and confusing those two creates enormous suffering. Bring something here that the most healing question in this entire conversation is: am I actually doing something harmful, or am I simply making someone uncomfortable by no longer abandoning myself? That question changes lives. So let's just go into one of the most important distinction in this entire conversation, because honestly, this single distinction can completely change how someone understand themselves. The Let's talk about difference between actual guilt and conditioned guilt, because many people live with chronic emotional confusion simply because these two experiences feel similar in the body, but psychologically they are not the same. Actual guilt, healthy guilt, reality based guilt. This is the kind of guilt that emerges when we genuinely violate our values, when we knowingly hurt someone, act unfairly, betray trust, cross boundaries, behave dishonestly, cause unnecessary harm. Healthy guilt has an ethical function. It says pause, reflect, repair, realign, and grow. That kind of guilt can be psychologically useful because it protects conscience. Human relationship need that, but conditioned guilt is different. Conditioned guilt does not necessarily emerge uh, because harm occurred. It emerges because an old emotional rule was activated. A familiar internal law got violated. And those internal laws often sound like: don't upset people, stay available, don't disappoint others, be useful, be accommodating, keep peace, be emotionally responsible, don't need too much, be easy. So when you violate those old rules, guilt appears, not because something unethical happened, because something unfamiliar happened. That distinction matters profoundly. Let me make this extremely practical. Scenario one: you intentionally lie to someone in a harmful way. Healthy guilt may rise. Makes sense. Scenario two: you politely decline an invitation because you are exhausted, and then spend 6 hours feeling like a terrible human being. That's not likely an ethical guilt. That's a conditioned guilt. Scenario three: you scream cruelly at someone in anger. Healthy guilt. Scenario 4: you don't answer messages for an evening because you don't need emotional quiet. Then feel physically anxious, likely conditioned guilt. Same uncomfortable feeling, entirely different psychological meaning. And this is where people get trapped because the body doesn't always differentiate clearly. Discomfort feels like discomfort. So the mind assumes if I feel bad, therefore I must have done something bad. Logic feels convincing, but it is often fails. Client saying something so revealing. She said, I know logically I'm allowed to rest, but emotionally it feels wrong. That sentence captured the entire struggle because insight alone does not dissolve conditioning. Knowing something cognitively and feeling safe, embodying it, are different psychological process. This is why healing is not merely intellectual, because your nervous system may still be organized around old emotional survival rules. A powerful therapeutic question I often explore is: what exactly feels wrong here? Because I feel guilty is often too broad. When we slow it down, the emotional story becomes clearer. Sometimes the real fear is they'll think I'm selfish. Sometimes they'll be hurt. Sometimes they'll be angry. Sometimes they'll be withdrawn. Sometimes they'll stop loving me. Or sometimes I won't recognize myself. The last one is especially profound because for some people, self abandonment becomes identity. So choosing themselves create internal disorientation. Who am I if I'm not endlessly available? Who am I if I stop fixing? I mean, so many questions can come. This is not just guilt. That's identity reorganization, which is psychologically much deeper. Once a client said, I finally told someone I couldn't emotionally support them every day. Then she immediately added, I felt cruel. So I asked, were you cruel? And then she paused. There was a long pause, and then she said, no, I was exhausted. That moment matters because exhaustion had been interrupted as cruelty. How many people live inside that distortion? Needing space becomes rejection, fatigues become failure, boundaries become aggression, privacy becomes secrecy. This is why language matters psychologically because how we label our experiences shapes emotional reality. People assumes if this feels uncomfortable it must be wrong, but emotional growth often feels uncomfortable precisely because it is unfamiliar, not because it's harmful. Major question is here while I'm talking about all this is how to begin changing these patterns without overwhelming yourself, how to set boundaries when guilt appears, how to calm the nervous system, how to rebuild internal permission, how to stop abandoning yourself without becoming emotionally shut down. This is where everything starts becoming actionable because insight is beautiful, understanding yourself is really powerful. But eventually the question becomes, what do I actually do when guilt shows up? Because if you're listening to this and reorganizing yourself, and you may be thinking, okay, this makes sense psychologically, but what happens when I actually say no and my body starts panicking? That's the real question. Because healing doesn't happen in theory, it happens in moment. Tiny, ordinary moments, a delayed reply, a boundary, a pause, choosing rest, asking for a space, not over explaining, letting someone be disappointed. That's where emotional rewiring happens. And I want to say something important right here. Healing is not becoming emotionally cold, it's not becoming indifferent, it's not becoming selfish, it's not suddenly not caring. That fear stops many people because they think if I stop people pleasing, will I become hard? No, healthy boundaries are not emotional numbness. Healthy boundaries are self respect and compassion. That's different. You do actually name the old emotional rules, what I have talked about, or ask yourself, am I unsafe or just uncomfortable? This question is transformative because nervous system often confuses discomfort with danger. You can ask, am I actually unsafe right now, or is this simply unfamiliar emotional discomfort? And this distinction is going to help you regulate. Try not to, I mean, provide too much of over explanation. This is difficult, especially for chronic accommodators, because guilt often creates the urge to justify. So instead of, I'm so sorry, I just have so much going on and I feel terrible and I didn't mean to disappoint you and maybe another time and I hope you understand. Something, sometimes healthy communication is simply, I won't be able to make it, and that's enough. Yes, you may feel wildly uncomfortable at first. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Please don't try emotional revolution overnight. That overwhelms the nervous system. Start small, very small. Practice micro boundaries. Delay one non urgent reply. Say not today. Ask for 10 minutes alone. Let people have their feeling. Rebuild relationship with your own needs. Expect guilt during healing. You're going to feel that because sometimes the guilt is simply withdrawal from old relational conditioning. That framing matters enormously. Regulate your body because this lives in the nervous system. Breathing, grounding, movement, somatic calming, yoga, self soothing, orientation, your resentments. Resentment is psychologically informative. Often, resentment marks chronic abandonment. If you repeatedly think, no one considers me, I do everything, I'm exhausted, I'm always invisible. Pause and ask, where am I saying yes when I mean no? That question can be life changing. Grieve. This may be the most unexpected part. Grieve the version of you that survived through self eraser. The child who learned adaptation, the adult who overfunctioned. Remember this, the goal is not becoming someone who never feels guilt. The goal is becoming someone who can feel guilt without automatically obeying it. This is emotional freedom because guilt is a feeling, not always a verdict. I think underneath all this, the question is, am I a good person if I stop abandoning myself? That's really what many people are wrestling with. Not just boundaries, not just guilt, but identity, goodness, lovability, worth. Because of your internal story has long been, I'm a valuable because I'm useful, I'm lovable because I'm accommodating, I'm safe because I'm easy. Then choosing yourself can feel like identity rupture. And identity rupture feels profoundly destabilizing because psychologically, human beings don't simply fear discomfort, we fear becoming someone unfamiliar to ourselves. Perhaps the deepest healing question is not why do I feel guilty, but what version of me believes I must suffer to be worthy of love? That question opens everything. So, if today's conversation felt painfully familiar, please know this: you're not weak, you're not broken, you're not selfish for having limits. You may simply be unlearning survival patterns that once protected you. And unlearning can feel frightening, but frightening is not the same as wrong. Leave you with this: feeling guilty does not always mean you have betrayed others. Sometimes it means you have finally stopped betraying yourself. And if this episode felt like someone quietly describing your inner life, you're deeply not alone. Thank you for spending this time with me today. This has been from the therapy room, Psychology of Mind and Body. And if this resonated with you, you can share what you felt or noticed. I would love to hear your reflection. Follow or subscribe to this podcast. Feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. So these spaces of reflection can continue to be a part of your journey. Until next time, take care of your mind and body and the quiet spaces within you. See you. I'll be sitting next besides to you. Take care.